In 1991, Janet Jackson signed the biggest recording contract in music history, then used it to stage a 1993 takeover. Financial, creative, and cultural, all at once. We officially crowned Janet the main pop girl of 1993, but that verdict only scratched the surface. Today, we're going deep on the album itself, how it happened, what it meant, and why the industry still wasn't ready to give her full credit for it. Let's start with the financial takeover, because the money tells you everything about the leverage Janet Jackson had accumulated by 1991. Her contract with A&M was winding down. She delivered two of the biggest albums of the late 80s, Control and Rhythm Nation 1814, and every major label knew she was available. What followed was, by all accounts, the largest bidding war in memory. Capitol wanted her, Atlantic wanted her, Virgin wanted her most. The New York Times didn't mince words. When the deal was announced, they declared it the most lucrative contract in the history of recording. Janet Jackson was 24 years old. The numbers were staggering. A 22% royalty rate, virtually unheard of at the time, plus a signing bonus that reports placed between $32 and $40 million, the largest guaranteed payout any artist had ever received. Chuck Phillips at the Los Angeles Times noted that one reason the bidding ran so high was that Janet was still a relatively fresh face on the pop scene, just 24, and her style was ideal for today's pop video climate. But Virgin wasn't just betting on her American success. They were betting on global expansion. Richard Branson, Virgin's chairman, flew out to meet with Janet personally to close the deal. His pitch, quote, "A Rembrandt rarely becomes available. When it does, there are many people who are determined to get it. I was determined," end quote. Jeff Iroff, Virgin's co-managing director, was more direct about the strategy. Janet is a world-class artist, and we expect her growth to be enormous. This was the first time the label had centrally coordinated a campaign on a worldwide basis. They weren't signing a pop star. They were investing in a global brand. And here's the detail that often gets overlooked. Within days of Janet's deal being announced, her brother Michael renegotiated his contract with Sony. The new terms reportedly exceeded Janet's. The Jackson siblings, consciously or not, were in an arms race, and the industry was bankrolling both sides. If you're enjoying this, please take a second to like, comment, and hit subscribe. More 90s and noughties pop analysis every week. So Janet had the biggest contract in history. What did she do with it? She took a risk that could have ended her career. Rhythm Nation 1814 was military, disciplined, socially conscious. It was an album about systems, poverty, prejudice, education. Janet positioned herself as a commander, rallying a generation, dressed in fatigues and key earrings, choreography drilled to industrial precision. And it worked. The album sold 8 million copies in America alone. The safe play would have been to make Rhythm Nation 2, more anthems, more social commentary, more of what had already proven successful. But Janet is something else entirely. The music journalist David Ritz, writing the album's cover story for Rolling Stone, made a comparison that I think is perfect. He likened Janet's evolution to Marvin Gaye's shift from what's going on to let's get it on, from the political to the personal, from the austere to the ecstatic. And crucially, both artists made that pivot without losing their intelligence or their sense of purpose. Janet herself was explicit about what she was doing. She described the album as a statement of sexual liberation. Quote, "Sex has always been an important part of me for several years, but it just hasn't blossomed publicly until now. I've had to go through some changes and shed some old attitudes before feeling completely comfortable with my body," she said. But this wasn't just thematic. It was structural. Janet took a larger role in songwriting and production than she ever had before. All my records are personal, she said, and Janet is the most personal of them all. That's why this time around it was important for me to write all the lyrics and half the melodies. That's not a performer delivering material, that's an artist staking a claim. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis remained her primary collaborators, but Janet pushed them into territory they'd never explored. She brought in Kathleen Battle, an opera soprano, for this time. She got Chuck D from Public Enemy to appear on New Agenda, an opera diva and a hardcore rapper on the same album. It shouldn't work, but it does. And the sampling was audacious. New Agenda built its foundation on Kool and the Gang's Cool It, Here Comes the Fuzz, and Stevie Wonder's Superwoman. If opened with an orchestral flourish lifted from Diana Ross and the Supremes' Someday We'll Be Together, a sample that exists, as Slant magazine later noted, for the sole purpose of providing the impetus behind one of the greatest dance break routines in music video history. Here's a detail that tells you everything about Janet's creative control. Virgin wanted If as the lead single. It was up-tempo, it was danceable. Janet, Jam, and Lewis disagreed. They pushed for That's the Way Love Goes, a slower, groovier, more sensual track that announced the album's intentions from the first note. And Janet won. That's the Way Love Goes became the biggest hit of her career. The sonic pivot was only half the transformation. The visual pivot was just as deliberate. In September 1993, Janet appeared on the cover of Rolling Stone, topless. Her then husband, Renee Elizondo Jr.'s hands covering her bare breasts. It became one of the most recognizable and most parodied magazine covers of the decade. But here's what gets lost in the conversation about that image. It wasn't exploitation, it was strategy. Janet controlled every aspect of the shoot. Patrick Demarchelier photographed it. The full-length version became the cover of the limited edition double-disc release. A cropped version, just her face, became the standard album cover. Her midriff appeared in the interior booklet. She parceled out her own image in degrees. In the cover story that accompanied the photograph, Janet explained, quote, "Listening to my new record, people intuitively understand the change in me. This wasn't an artist being convinced to take her clothes off to sell records. This was an artist using her body as a statement of ownership over her image, her sexuality, her narrative." Sonia Murray of the Vancouver Sun captured the duality perfectly. Quote, "Jackson remains clearly established as both role model and sex symbol. That's a needle that's incredibly hard to thread, and Janet made it look easy. The transformation was complete, from military commander to what exactly? Not a sex object, but something more complicated." So did the gamble pay off? Let's talk receipts. Janet debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. That made Janet the first female artist to debut at the top spot in the SoundScan era. First week sales, 350,000 copies, the largest opening week for a female artist at that point in history. Remember that lead single Virgin Didn't Want? That's the Way Love Goes entered the Hot 100 at #14 and climbed to #1, where it stayed for 8 consecutive weeks. 8 weeks! No Jackson had ever done that. Not Michael, not the Jacksons as a group, not the Jackson 5, Janet. The album spawned 6 top 10 singles. That's the Way Love Goes, #1 for 8 weeks. Again, #1 for 2 weeks. Anytime, Anyplace, #2. If, #4. Because of Love, #10. And You Want This, #8. And again also earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song, and Janet performed it at the ceremony. The nomination itself was a statement. This wasn't just a pop album anymore. By year's end, Janet was the second best-selling album of 1993 in the United States, behind only the Bodyguard soundtrack and the biggest-selling album by a solo artist. It moved 4.3 million copies domestically in those first 6 months. The album eventually reached 6 times platinum in the US. Worldwide, it sold over 14 million copies, and it remains Janet's best-selling record. Virgin got their Rembrandt. and then some. The album was a takeover. The tour was a coronation. The Janet Tour launched in November 1993 in Cincinnati and ran through the following year. It was Janet's second world tour, but it operated on an entirely different scale than anything she'd done before. The production was theatrical in a way pop concerts rarely attempted. Over 100 costume changes across the show, designed by stylist Tanya Gill. The wardrobe ranged from, and I'm quoting the press materials here, pipe bone vests with high-heeled moccasin boots to zoot suits and top hats to circus ringmaster bustiers. A team of 50 costume makers worked under wardrobe supervisor Helen Hyatt just to keep the show running. In December, Janet held a 4-show residency at Madison Square Garden, culminating in a New Year's Eve performance. 4 nights at the Garden. For context, that's not something you do unless you're operating at the absolute peak of the industry. Michael Snyder, reviewing the tour for the San Francisco Chronicle, wrote that Janet's performance, quote, erased the line between stadium-size pop music concerts and full-scale theatrical extravaganzas. That's the key insight. Janet wasn't just touring an album, she was staging a production. The visual identity, the choreography, the costume design, it all reinforced the same message as the music. This was an artist in complete control of her presentation. Every element served the whole. So the public showed up. The numbers don't lie. But the critics, they were divided in ways that are fascinating to revisit. Rolling Stone got it. Their review declared, quote, as Princess of America's Black royal family, everything Janet Jackson does is important. They understood the cultural weight of what she was attempting and concluded that the princess has announced herself sexually mature and surrendered none of her crown's luster in the process. Billboard was similarly enthusiastic, a glamorous assortment of styles, pop, dance, R&B, rock, jazz, rap, each delivered with consummate skill and passion. They called it a career-defining record, earning Janet the right to operate on a first-name basis. But not everyone agreed. Chris Willman at the Los Angeles Times was dismissive. He acknowledged the album would succeed commercially, but argued that it would do so, quote, not because it's any great piece of work, but largely for its aphrodisiacal aspirations, whatever that means. He suggested the only reason the album would cause a reaction was because of Janet's previously conservative image. The music itself? Apparently not worth much discussion. David Brown at Entertainment Weekly was harsher still. Janet sounds like a mess, period, he wrote, arguing that despite the album's musical variety, Janet still sounds like a young woman from a male-dominated family who is searching for her identity and voice. And David Sinclair at the Times complained that Janet, quote, tends to confuse sex with soul, end quote. Reading these reviews now, what strikes me isn't that they're negative. Negative reviews happen. What strikes me is that they're actually criticizing a young woman asserting sexual agency, a black artist from a famous family trying to establish her own identity. The reviews that dismissed Janet weren't really engaging with the music. They were uncomfortable with what the music represented. Which brings us to the cultural takeover. And this is where Janet becomes something bigger than chart positions and critical debates. Before this album, there was no established template for a young woman in pop music to be explicitly, unapologetically sexual on her own terms, in her own voice, with full creative control. Madonna had provoked, but provocation was the point of what Madonna did. Janet did something different. She presented sexuality as natural and joyful, and crucially, owned entirely by her. That distinction matters. Think about what follows in the next decade. Britney Spears doesn't get to make the transition from teen pop star to I'm a slave for you without Janet showing it could be done, and done with intention rather than scandal. The 2001 VMAs performance that supposedly shocked America, Janet had done something more radical 8 years earlier, and she'd done it on her own terms. Christina Aguilera doesn't get to release Stripped in 2002 and be taken seriously as an artist reclaiming her image without Janet as precedent. The whole narrative of stripped, shedding the manufactured pop persona, embracing sexuality as empowerment, that's Janet's playbook. Beyoncé doesn't arrive at B-Day in 2006 with that confidence, that fusion of R&B and sexuality as power, without Janet as a blueprint. The visual album concept that Beyoncé would later perfect, Janet was already thinking in those terms. The album, the videos, the tour, the image, all functioning as a unified artistic statement. It's common now to downplay Janet's impact or compare her stats to her brothers, but the reality of 1993 is undeniable. She wasn't living in anyone's shadow. She was the sun. Slant Magazine's retrospective called Janet, quote, the mother of eclectic genre-hopping records, pointing to Aguilera, Gwen Stefani, and Fergie as direct descendants. And they identified something else. Janet is a feminist statement, to be sure. That's the cultural takeover. Not just what the album did in 1993, the door it opened for women in the industry 2 decades later, which makes what happened at the 1994 Grammys genuinely baffling. Janet received 2 nominations, Best R&B Vocal Performance, Female, and Best R&B Song for That's the Way Love Goes. She won the latter. But in the 3 major categories, Record of the Year, Song of the Year, and Album of the Year, Janet Jackson was nowhere to be found. Greg Kot, writing in the Chicago Tribune, called the oversight doubly vexing because Janet wasn't just a multi-platinum pop act. She was, quote, an artist who has reshaped the sound and image of rhythm and blues over the last decade. The prevailing theory was that voters still saw her as a producer-dependent artist, someone who showed up, hit her marks, and let Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis do the real work, which rather ignores the fact that she wrote every lyric on the album and half the melodies. Jimmy Jam himself pushed back on this narrative, saying, it's easy to say that the 2 albums she did before she met us weren't successful, and when she got with us, she became successful. Control was the first album she actually had input. I think that's just as significant as the fact we did the record. The Grammys have a long history of undervaluing Black artists, particularly Black women, and particularly in the major categories. Janet wasn't the first album to get that treatment, and it certainly wasn't the last. But given what this album meant, given the template it created, the doors it opened, the snub feels particularly egregious in hindsight. She changed everything, and they gave her Best R&B Song. So where does Janet sit in Janet Jackson's catalog? For me, it's some of her best work. Artistically, this is the album where every element aligned. The creative ambition, the commercial execution, the cultural moment, and the visual presentation. It's the album where Janet stopped being Michael Jackson's little sister and became Janet. Full stop, first name only. The album title wasn't an accident. It's also, and this matters, an album that sounds genuinely fresh 30 years later. The production hasn't dated the way that so much early 90s R&B has. The songwriting holds up, and Janet's vocal performances, which critics consistently underrated at the time, have a confidence and a sensuality that still feel vital. Is it a perfect record? No. The back half loses some momentum. Not every deep cut justifies its place on the track list. If you trimmed 2 or 3 songs, you'd have something tighter. But the highs are extraordinary. The ambition is undeniable, and the influence is immeasurable. Janet is the album where Janet Jackson proved to the industry, to her family's legacy, to herself, that she wasn't just a pop star. She was an architect, and the house she built, we're all still living in it. Next Sunday, we're crowning 1994's main pop girl, and Mariah Carey is about to enter her imperial phase. You don't want to miss it.